having a presence of European troops there, I am sure, would make a difference to the Russian calculations of whether they would violate a ceasefire and how they would do it.
You mentioned the command centre that you visited near Pokrovsk. Can you just tell me a little bit more like what it was like inside and what kind of information was being processed?
So these command centers, I've been in a few of them. They are normally underground. There's no natural light. They're trying to keep out any kind of spying eyes. And they're obviously fortified. They're usually pretty crowded. There's a lot of officers milling around looking at screens. There's huge banks of screens. A lot of technology is being processed here. So they have drone feeds, multiple drone feeds from the battlefield in the areas above their troops, other drones that are hunting for the Russians, trying to identify where the Russians are. They have these applications with a huge amount of information from all over the battlefield, which show the last sighting of a Russian vehicle, the last sighting of a Russian position. The time and the date is on there. And then they have the imprints of their troops as well. So you see these kind of red lines where the Russians are thought to be, green lines where the Ukrainian troops are supposed to be, yellow where Ukrainian allied battalions might be, and then these kind of blue markers, which is like a Russian tank was last seen here at this time. So they might still be around. And the commanders have to process all of this data now. So the level of kind of mental acuity that is required for being an officer on today's battlefield is quite significant. And people who have learned this over time have become quite good at it without any kind of formal military education necessarily. They've been just experienced. And others find it completely overwhelming that they have to deal with all this information, and they also have to look after the welfare of their men in the kind of traditional sense that you would as an officer, and deploy people and move them around. And some of the pictures on the battlefield are quite astonishing. There was one village that we were looking at on the screen, and I was wondering how these green and red lines were intertwined. And it's because the Ukrainian troops were in some houses in the village, and Russians could be in the house next door. And so this line was just mixed amongst each other. And the whole time, they might occasionally engage each other in a firefight, but they're mostly underground trying to stay away from the drones. And the drones in the air are trying to spot whoever comes out and hit them with a grenade or a suicide attack as soon as they're out in the open.
The command centre that you were in was used to command the Vinci Wolves battalion. Can you tell us a little bit more about these soldiers, where they came from? Because they're now officially part of, or been absorbed into the Ukrainian army, but they didn't start like that, did they?
Right. So the leader of this battalion that we met is a guy called, his call sign is Fila, and he was fighting for Ukraine against the Russians in 2014 as part of which was a kind of paramilitary formation. And these were young guys in their teens at the time who came together, football hooligans actually, who enjoyed their time at the terraces, liked a bit of a scrap. And then saw that the Russians were coming in and encroaching on their territory, killing their friends, and they decided that they would join up and try and stop the Russians in the Donbass in 2014 when they were having this hybrid invasion. And they have been fighting ever since then. So they are very experienced. The original leader of this battalion, a guy who was called Da Vinci, was sadly killed in action towards the beginning of the war. And Filia has taken over command. He's a very experienced officer, and his force is regarded as, very effective, very motivated fighters, and they've been incorporated within a brigade in the regular Ukrainian army. And it's interesting to speak to him because he has a kind of a different perspective on how the armed forces of Ukraine should be arranged. And those perspectives, I think, are now being recognized with a reform of the Ukrainian army into a corps system. Previously, Ukraine had arranged its defenses based on command being allocated to a certain area. So the priority was seen to be that the defense of that area was more important than the lives of the soldiers who were assigned to defend it. And officers were held accountable for losing territory in that area because the geographical area is what they're responsible for. The corps system is designed to put soldiers at the center of the Ukrainian army. So it's more important to preserve the lives of their men necessarily than hold on to a piece of territory that provides no strategic or tactical advantage. And we're looking now at how that is going to play out on the ground. There's one corps that has been built, and it's been assigned to General Bieletsky, and how that's going to affect the war going forward. That's something we're going to be investigating in future dispatches. It's still in the very early days, but it could mean that a lot of lives are not wasted by Ukrainian generals who just want to hold on to a piece of land, and they fight more in a smarter way to preserve their manpower and to focus on killing more Russians for losing less Ukrainian lives.
And you wrote a bit about what this commander told you about what their experience, because he'd been fighting for 11 years himself, but what that kind of experience in fighting the Russians has brought to their how effective they can be on the battlefield when you compare them to the more newly Western trained equipped soldiers. And you mentioned earlier about how they had to bring in more experienced forces from the Kursk region because of the problems they were having with these new brigades. But what kind of information and experience do they have they can impart, and which Western militaries can learn about fighting the Russians?
Well, I think one of the main things is they're survivors. They're people who fought since 2014 and survived, and they've learned, how ruthless you need to be on the battlefield, how to stay alive in these conditions. And they've gradually learned, because they've been on the battlefield the entire time, how the drones work, how to negate the drones, how to avoid being detected. And those are all skills that are very important to be passed on by an experienced officer corps and they're working with these complicated technologies as well at the same time, and trying to make sure that all their men on the ground have internet, because this is an increasingly really important part of the way that communications are conducted. Some of the ways that orders are given to soldiers on the battlefield is that someone will swipe with a tablet a line, which is a kind of a marching order of where that's safe on the battlefield, where avoiding your minefields, avoiding enemy minefields, avoiding detection. That's how you move people around, almost like a computer game in some respects. So people need to be familiar with how to do that. They also need to know, how to teach and motivate people on the ground. And that's something I think that Western armies are struggling to keep up with. They have it all in theory, but how to do that when your command center is being shelled, when you're losing guys on the ground, and it's a very different thing from having very good training, and when you know that you're going to end up at the end of that alive, from when your life is under kind of an existential threat. And can you stand out of cover and shoot your Kalashnikov at people encroaching on your position? And very often it's not the people that were good in the training class or good at absorbing the information that actually survive and go on to kind of teach people how to. It's only once you have that battlefield experience that you can see really who are good leaders and who are not.
And you've got a very strong feeling that the men would rather fight on than accept a bad peace deal, even if it was forced upon President Zelensky. What do you think would make them stop?
I think, well, obviously, if Russia was to withdraw from Ukraine, they would obviously stop at that point. I think there is another complication here in the Da Vinci Wolves, and there are other brigades like Hardship Brigade, Kraken. They a complicated set of loyalties, actually, because they're funded often by kind of major businesses in their area. They have different loyalties necessarily, and they've been to just President Zelensky. So if President Zelensky was to say, we've got this bad peace deal, but it's the best one we're going to have, it's not clear that people like that would accept that they had lost for 11 years their brothers in arms and would stop fighting the Russians and allow them to take over the territory that they've been fighting for so long. So I think it's difficult. They want to see Russia fought to a standstill, exhausted. A lot of them feel that this is still possible. If the West was to provide these substantial aid in a particular moment, a kind of surge in aid, then they still think that they could overwhelm the Russians, and hold their lines and maybe push them back slightly. But the Russian economy has been creaking for a long time, but how long can it seriously last like this? And that's one of the reasons they're so frustrated. They see at the moment there are Ukrainian drone strikes every night now against Russian oil refineries. That's the lifeblood of the Russian economy is being taken out every day. They feel that they're having an effect, and now Trump is talking about a ceasefire on energy infrastructure, which would actually benefit the Russians. It's still very difficult to see a way out of all of this, because they are determined to defend their land. Putin is still issuing these maximalist demands. There doesn't seem to be a place where soldiers like this would accept essentially a defeat in order to have some kind of peace, because they know that it would be short-lived.
And interesting, because you said earlier that when you were in that command center, you've been in several before. Do you get a real sense as a reporter of déjà vu?
I think they are similar. You have commanders doing similar things in different places. Every few months it evolves. So you see kind of better drones, clearer pictures. There, from the beginning of the war, there may be a few feeds, some camera feeds. Now, a command center is an entire bank of screens. There are screens everywhere, huge screens, with so much data presented on it. It's fascinating, the kind of granular detail that they have, the information that they can have on the battlefield. When I was in Sumy, there was one commander who was scrolling through his tablet, showing me the different Ukrainian positions, and he pointed out this guy was wounded, and they had the information about he was wounded, when he was reported wounded. He kind of had roughly a good idea of how long he could hold on for before he would die. They didn't know whether they'd be able to get him out, but they have this kind of information. Um, and it is astonishing to see the technology that's being used. And I was in a classroom yesterday. I'm going to be writing about this in a forthcoming dispatch, where soldiers are being trained in electronic warfare, because it's become a cliche to talk about this drone war, but really that is how it's not rifles anymore, it's drones. That's how ordinary soldiers are fighting each other with drones. And that means that electronic warfare is incredibly important, your ability to jam the opposition's drones. And this is kind of sophisticated stuff. So people are having to learn physics and maths in classrooms. And these are guys who were kind of farmers yesterday, or had a butcher shop, and they've been chosen for some reason. They still don't have very good selection criteria by their officers to go and attend this electronic warfare class. And the teacher that was talking to me said, "Look, I've been learning this field for 6 years to kind of get my knowledge of radio frequencies and what does what." And I have to teach these guys in 23 days, and their lives depend on it. And it's a really interesting mismatch between a kind of your average expectation of a soldier and what kind of education they need, to now having to navigate this very complicated technology in the battlefield, and to navigate it very quickly, otherwise you die.
On the political side of things, Sir Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, is holding a meeting in London today of the so-called Coalition of the Willing, and the idea of assembling troops to support any ceasefire seems a long way off, if ever possible, at the moment. The EU is also expected to be reiterating its commitment to coordinating support for Ukraine today, taking steps to make billions of euros worth of military aid available, pursue peace through strength. What exactly do you think is needed for Ukraine from Europe to secure its survival? And can it do it without the US if the US does become absent?
Well, I think it is really important to have a contingency plan. If there is a ceasefire, what is it going to look like? How do we ensure it's a lasting ceasefire, and not, like the ceasefires after 2014, which were just violated. And having a presence of European troops there, I am sure, would make a difference to the Russian calculations of whether they would violate a ceasefire and how they would do it. So I think those are really important plans. Obviously, there is no European country which has enough troops at the moment to kind of single-handedly perform that. So they need to come together. They need to find a way to operate together. It's a very, very large front line. So we are talking about tens of thousands of troops. Whether 30,000 can be enough, I'm not sure. I think what they really need is to make sure that the Polish come on board. I mean, this is a huge armed force, and they have a lot to lose if Ukraine capitulates and Russian forces are on their border. But they have a really strong force in that part of the world, so they need to be fully on board with this. I think the air power thing is something that really needs to be looked at, because air power is something that I think Europe as a whole is still going to be much stronger, has more sophisticated, more advanced technology in the air than the Russians, and how to safeguard Ukrainian airspace is a really important discussion to be having. More important, I think, than troops on the ground, which maybe provide a deterrent. But if it actually comes to a ceasefire being violated, what are they going to do? Planes in the air can shoot down Russian missiles, can shoot down Russian drones, without necessarily putting themselves in a great deal of harm. So that I think is really important. Those discussions happen. I think it's right that the EU is looking to step up its defense spending, and really the Ukraine at the moment is the best way to defend Europe, because Europe just doesn't have the troop numbers. Ukraine does. Ukraine has about 1 million men in armed service at the moment, and some of those are very motivated. Some of them are experienced. These are the guys who are learning how to fight the Russians. The European forces don't know. They learn some lessons, and some of the special forces that are in Ukraine have learned lessons about how to fight the Russians. But as an armed force as a whole, they don't know how to fight the Russians. They don't know this new form of warfare. And they're going to rely on the Ukrainians to teach them that and to integrate with them. So I think that, it's beneficial for European forces to help Ukraine hold the line. And it's important for them to integrate with the Ukrainian forces as much as possible to learn the lessons of how it is to fight Russia.
Maxim, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for your time. I better let you get back to writing your next dispatch. Look forward to seeing it. All the best.
Thanks very much, Kate.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.